Chapter 5, Violence Prevention, Structural Harm, and Ethical Leadership in Practice. Abstract. This chapter advances violence prevention as the central ethical obligation of leadership in contemporary organizational, civic, and technological systems. Moving beyond event-based or punitive definitions of violence, the chapter reframes harm as a structural, normalized, and often invisible process sustained by coercive incentives, distorted consent, and unregulated power. Drawing explicitly on the foundations established in chapters 1 to 4, quiet excellence, holistic healing, presence, and ethical measurement, this chapter articulates violence prevention as a daily leadership discipline grounded in nervous system regulation, lawful boundaries, and nonviolent governance. Integrating trauma-informed neuroscience, public interest law, leadership ethics, and ethical AI governance, the chapter provides practical frameworks for identifying, interrupting, and preventing harm across interpersonal, organizational, and systemic domains. Violence prevention is thus positioned not as crisis response, but as the defining practice of ethical leadership and human flourishing. Keywords: violence prevention, structural harm, ethical leadership, consent, nonviolence, lawful governance, trauma-informed systems. 5.1 Reframing violence, from events to systems. Conventional approaches to violence focus narrowly on visible incidents, physical assault, overt abuse, or criminal acts, often responding only after harm has occurred. While necessary, this event-based framing obscures the deeper ethical failure. Violence is typically prepared long before it erupts. It is normalized through policies, incentives, language, and power structures that erode consent and dignity over time. This chapter reframes violence as a process, not an anomaly. Structural harm emerges when systems reward compliance over consent, efficiency over safety, and outcomes over process. In such environments, coercion becomes subtle, routinized, and socially acceptable. Ethical leadership, therefore, must be judged not by its reaction to crisis, but by its capacity to prevent harm before it becomes visible. This reframing builds directly on Chapter 1's articulation of quiet excellence as harm preventive leadership grounded in regulation and restraint. 5.2 Violence as structural and relational phenomenon. Violence does not require malicious intent. Structural violence operates through constrained choices, economic pressure, role asymmetries, and psychological manipulation. Leaders may sincerely believe they are acting responsibly while participating in systems that exhaust, silence, or degrade others. Drawing on trauma-informed neuroscience, Chapter 2, this chapter emphasizes that chronic exposure to threat, financial insecurity, social marginalization, institutional precarity produces adaptive survival responses that narrow ethical perception. When these adaptations are mirrored or exploited by leadership structures, harm becomes systemic rather than personal. Violence prevention therefore requires leaders to examine how authority is structured, not merely how it is exercised. 5.3 False consent and ethical breakdown. A central mechanism of structural harm is false consent, apparent agreement extracted under pressure, fear, dependency, or information asymmetry. False consent is ethically invalid even when legally ambiguous. As developed in chapters 2 and 3, genuine consent requires physiological safety, relational freedom, and lawful alternatives. When leaders rely on compliance while ignoring withdrawal cues, silence, or constrained choice, they participate in coercion, even without overt force. Ethical leadership demands the capacity to recognize and interrupt false consent, particularly in hierarchical systems such as workplaces, educational institutions, and digital platforms. 5.4 Economic coercion and structural dependence. Violence prevention must explicitly address economic coercion. Financial dependency can function as a powerful mechanism of control, creating conditions where individuals appear to choose harm in order to survive. Ethical leadership requires transparency around financial power, fair compensation, accessible exit options, and safeguards against retaliatory deprivation. Leaders who ignore economic asymmetry while invoking consent engage in structural violence. This insight extends quiet excellence into material and institutional realities, reinforcing that ethical restraint must operate at both psychological and systemic levels. 5.5 Violence prevention as daily leadership discipline. Violence prevention is not episodic. It is practiced daily through decision pacing, boundary enforcement, language choice, incentive design, and accountability mechanisms. As argued in Chapter 3, presence enables leaders to detect early signs of harm, escalation, withdrawal, moral rigidity, before they solidify into abuse. Preventative leadership prioritizes containment over domination and repair over justification. This discipline reframes leadership excellence as the ability to stop harm from forming, not merely to manage its aftermath. 5.6 Lawful leadership in nonviolence law plays a central role in violence prevention by formalizing boundaries, rights, and accountability. Ethical leadership aligns with law, not as minimum compliance, but as protective infrastructure for dignity and safety. This chapter emphasizes that trauma awareness does not excuse violations of due process or boundary erosion. On the contrary, lawful restraint is what prevents trauma-informed language from becoming a tool of paternalism or exceptionalism. Violence prevention succeeds when internal regulation, Chapter 2, and external accountability, Chapter 4, function together. 5.7 Organizational and institutional applications. In organizational contexts, violence often appears as chronic burnout, humiliation-based management, retaliatory evaluation, or silencing of dissent. Preventative leadership redesigns systems to reduce these risks through transparent grievance processes, consent-aware performance metrics, regulated feedback loops, and leadership training grounded in nervous system literacy. These practices operationalize quiet excellence at scale. 5.8 Ethical AI and structural harm prevention. Technological systems can amplify violence when they optimize efficiency without ethical restraint. Algorithms may encode coercive logics, surveillance, exclusion, pressure, while distancing decision makers from accountability. Building on Chapter 4, this section asserts that ethical AI must be evaluated not only for bias or accuracy, but for its violence preventive capacity. Key questions include: does the system increase or reduce constrained choice? Does it preserve lawful appeal and human oversight? Does it escalate pressure or support dignity? Ethical leadership in AI design is thus inseparable from violence prevention. 5.9 Intersectionality and differential vulnerability. Violence and coercion are experienced unevenly across gender, race, class, disability, age, and cultural context. Ethical leadership must account for these differential vulnerabilities without reducing individuals to identities. Intersectional awareness strengthens violence prevention by revealing where neutral systems disproportionately harm marginalized groups. Quiet excellence demands attentiveness to these patterns while maintaining universal ethical standards of dignity and consent. 5.10 Family education and early systems violence prevention begins long before organizational leadership. Family systems, schools, and caregiving institutions shape early experiences of consent, boundaries, and authority. Leaders in education and family policy bear ethical responsibility to prevent normalization of coercion through shaming, fear-based discipline, or economic pressure. Preventative leadership in these domains lays the groundwork for future civic trust and nonviolent participation. 5.11 Restorative practices and ethical repair. While prevention is primary, ethical leadership must also address harm when it occurs. Restorative practices, when voluntary, lawful, and non-coercive, can support repair, accountability, and reintegration. This chapter situates restorative justice as complementary to prevention, not a substitute for it. Repair without prevention risks repetition. Prevention without repair risks moral rigidity. Ethical leadership holds both. 5.112 Global legal and cultural contexts. Violence prevention operates within diverse legal systems, civil law, common law, hybrid, and authoritarian contexts. While legal mechanisms differ, the ethical principles of dignity, consent, and nonviolence remain constant. Quiet excellence offers a cross-cultural framework adaptable to local law, while resisting relativism that excuses harm. Ethical leadership requires contextual intelligence without abandoning universal safeguards. 5.13 Conclusion. Leadership as the practice of protection. This chapter has established violence prevention as the defining practice of ethical leadership. By integrating nervous system regulation, lawful boundaries, ethical measurement, and systemic design, quiet excellence reframes leadership as the art of protecting life, dignity, and agency before harm occurs. Violence prevention is not ancillary to leadership, it is its moral core. Leaders who prevent harm quietly, lawfully, and consistently embody the highest form of excellence.